Right now, Chelsea haven't breached the PSR rules.
Short term, they're fine. Longer term, big potential problems.
It does increasingly and more than ever feel like footballers are being treated, I don't want to be too harsh, but like a piece of meat or a number or a piece on a chessboard. The question you get asked as a journalist every time you post a story on this subject or talk about it is, what about Manchester City? It's a bit of a stain against the competition that this has been running for so long.
Everton have been docked 10 points and then 2 points for single breaches of PSR. City are accused of 7 breaches of PSR alone, as well as all the rest. So if they're found guilty of a fraction of the allegations against them, the punishment is almost limitless.
Hello and welcome. I'm Olly Clink with a new Premier League season on the way, with new teams, new managers. It's fair to say that the business off the field hasn't taken a break. From potential player strikes against FIFA to transfer sagas dominated by new buzzwords such as FFP and PSR, it can be tough to get your head around what this all means for your club and what it means for football itself. Well, joining me to help get to the bottom of it all are the Athletic's David Ornstein and sports journalist Matt Hughes. Gentlemen, welcome to you both.
Thanks, Ollie.
Let's dive straight in, shall we, to the story dominating the football world. Manchester City's alleged breaches of FFP, 115 charges against them. That's a number we've heard a lot because this has been rumbling on. But we now have a date set, or rather a month set, for when this hearing will take place. We're hearing it will be September. David, I'll start with you. Given how long that this has gone on, just how significant is it that we now appear to have a timeline in place?
Yeah, I think it's really good for football supporters, for the Premier League, because it's a bit of a stain against the competition that this has been running for so long. The investigation has been going since, 2019 or something. The allegations, 2009 to 2018 are the time span. I presume some people following football weren't even born at that point. And we're getting to a stage now that if there's no resolution, it's going to undermine even further the credibility of the competition, the product, the trust of the public and the fans in what we're watching. Now, we knew it was going to be coming in the autumn. We thought around October, November time. The latest reports suggest September. Of course, that could always be pushed back because of legal wrangling. And then there will be the hearing, and then there will be conversations afterwards, deliberations. The panel are going to have to write up their report, suggestions it will go into at the very least early 2025 until we hear an outcome. That could still be subject to challenge and appeals. And that wouldn't surprise you, given how vigorously Manchester City have fought this situation until now. We all remember that day in February of 2023, was it, or 2022, when the charges were laid down, 115. Latest round of reports suggest that that's actually been amended to 130 charges. That was a report by Martin Ziegler in the Times. The Premier League aren't commenting on that. They're keeping their cards very close to their chest on this. But now, yeah, we at least have a time, a sort of fork in the road in when we could have some kind of clarity on what's going to happen here. And given all of the issues around financial fair play, profitability and sustainability, the words that we seem to be talking about more than ever now, and we're looking at Everton and Nottingham Forest, even Chelsea being considered, all clubs now understanding that these financial rules have teeth. The question you get asked as a journalist every time you post a story on this subject or talk about it is, what about Manchester City? Well, we shouldn't be too far away from finding out.
Matt, I think David makes a really interesting point there. How pleased do you think the Premier League will be? Because, as he says, they've faced so many questions, given how swiftly you'd imagine they acted with the likes of Everton and Nottingham Forest. How pleased do you think the Premier League will be that finally there is something they can say to fans in respect of, listen, this hearing will be taking place? It could drag on quite long, but at least there is that timeline there.
I think they'll be pleased to have a date in the diary. I believe September the 16th has been penciled in for the start point for a 10-week hearing. So the Premier League would be pleased by that. They can't really speak to the fans or even their own clubs about this at all. That's part of the problem, and it's a huge part of the reason why they've been so widely criticised, just because of the legal implications. They cannot say anything. They don't even brief journalists anonymously on this. It's very, very hard to get any information, which is why, as David says, so many people keep asking about it, because there is an information vacuum about this. I think it might just be worth spelling out the scale of this thing, because it's often compared to Everton and Forest, but it's in a different stratosphere, both in terms of what City are accused of and therefore the potential implications. Everyone has the number 115 in their heads, which might now be increased to 150, as David says. But in terms of what they've been charged with, it's probably worth going through the charges. The charges, I've got them here. 54 failures to provide accurate financial information, 14 failures to provide accurate details of player and manager salaries, Roberto Mancini, the manager, involved, 5 breaches of UEFA's FFP rules, 7 breaches of the Premier League's PSR rules, and then 35 failures to cooperate. I mean, it's just huge. Everton been docked 10 points and then 2 points for single breaches of PSR. City accused of 7 breaches of PSR alone, as well as all the rest. So if they're found guilty of a fraction of the allegations against them, the punishment is well, almost limitless.
I mean, David, when Matt spells it out like that, it does sound very ominous for Manchester City. They will attack this with lawyers. They will come back, as you've said. There will be appeals, you would imagine. But is there any way to predict just how strong this punishment could be for Manchester City?
No, I think we'd be guessing and speculating. I don't think that's responsible in this case, because Manchester City have insisted throughout that they are innocent, that they have irrefutable evidence to prove that innocence. They are convinced that they will come out on top in this, and so their supporters. We didn't say who this would also be good for. Manchester City and their supporters will feel this is an opportunity finally to be vindicated and to have this stigma lifted from above their heads. We'll have to wait and see how that pans out. But the size and the scale and the magnitude that Matt talks about there, a couple of things I wanted to add. A lot of the offences alleged offences, are repeat. So that's helped inflate the number, because many people say, wow, 115 separate charges. That's not the case. Because of the time span, it's often, in many of those that Matt lays out, year after year of the same thing, including non-compliance and alleged inflating of sponsorships artificially with the help of their ownership being disguised, and so on. There's another thing in this, that the charges that have been faced by Everton, Nottingham Forest are described informally as like simple PSR cases, whereas Manchester City is defined as being more complex, as Matt explains. So when people are getting understandably frustrated and concerned and angry about the delays here and suggesting there is an agenda against their clubs and in favour of Manchester City, and why are you letting them go? They're not. They're completely different cases, completely different charges, completely different time eras. And there will be an unbelievably vigorous defence from Manchester City. Sort of some of the best lawyers in the industry. Lord Panic is among those leading their charge, the KC, who's quite renowned. We're not undermining the legal force that, say, Everton and Nottingham Forest, and maybe Chelsea, if it ever comes to them too, will have on their side. But Manchester City have already proved with UEFA that they can defend themselves, and ultimately the ban that they were handed for European competition was lifted, and they will feel vindicated by that process, and they'll be adamant that they can do so again.
Just on this, in terms of, in a more broader sense, Matt, as well, do you feel that this is an isolated case towards Manchester City in terms of what they've been alleged of doing, or is there any sense that we could find that this is similar with some other clubs as well, especially during that period that's being looked at, 2009 to 2018?
Well, there is another case that is ongoing regarding Chelsea in a similar period. It doesn't relate to FFP, PSR breaches as such, but it is. They're accused of failing to disclose all of their transfer payments. The allegations have been reported in the Dutch media and then consequently over here about hidden payments made to Eden Hazard's agent. The Premier League are investigating that. They've yet to charge them, but if they do charge them, then they could be facing similar issues. One complication is that was, of course, under the previous ownership at Chelsea when the club was owned by Roman Abramovich. Ironically, Chelsea actually, the new Chelsea regime, led by Todd Boehly and Bedard Igbale, they self-reported these alleged offences to the Premier League. So they effectively handed themselves in to the authorities. But could still, of course, be punished for it because it's different ownership, but it's the same club and they will have benefited indirectly in terms of the value of the club from the success of Chelsea under Abramovich. So it's all incredibly complicated, and there's another case we follow with interest.
I just wanted to add something because I didn't actually answer your question, Ollie, about the potential punishment because I didn't want to speculate. But as per the rules, and you would have seen this when Martin Ziegler did the most recent story and others have reported throughout, there's a whole range of punishments available to the authorities, and the worst of them being, I guess, relegation from the Premier League. That's what everybody's talked about. And they see the punishments that have been dished out in terms of points penalties to Everton, Nottingham Forest, and they kind of extrapolate that to guarantee that Manchester City will be thrown out of the Premier League, thrown out of football altogether, fined, transfer bans and embargoes. The truth is we don't know. We don't even know if they will be found guilty. And so that's why we're not at that point. And similar, if the Chelsea case comes in whatever shape or form, there will be ranges of options available. There's also a case just before we even get to the Manchester City FFP PSR case. And that's something that's been happening at this very moment in time related to a case that Manchester City have brought against the Premier League, challenging their rules on associated party transactions and who you can do sponsorship deals with, essentially, and saying that they're unlawful, they're an unfair restriction on trade. If they're successful with that, and there are rumours that they've at least been successful with some of the sort of case, then that could have an impact on the big case that's coming, because it could set some sort of a precedent if the clubs, or Manchester City in this case, succeed in proving what they're trying to prove on transactions between related parties, then that is essentially, in a certain way, what they've been accused of in these 115, 130 charges. So they could take the result of that and use it in their favour, in their mind, when it comes to the big one. So maybe fewer people are paying attention to what's happening right now, and we should hear an outcome relatively soon. But that is almost the precursor for what's to come, to an extent.
Just from a journalism perspective as well, these alleged breaches, I think were first brought to our attention by Der Spiegel, the German newspaper. Is there any sense, Matt, do you think, for fans of the Premier League, that they should be slightly concerned that actually it was the German newspaper that initially revealed these and it was less down to the work of the league itself?
Well, we're going back a long time, aren't we? And I think we're going back to a time when the Premier League's enforcement was probably not as rigorous as it is now. David may have a view on that. For a long time, there's been this narrative that the Premier League aren't looking, they don't want to enforce their own rules. I think what we've seen over the last 12 months is very clear that is not the case. They've imposed points deductions against 2 clubs. They've also charged Leicester City, who will almost certainly be docked points over the coming season. It's very clear the Premier League have become more rigorous in enforcing their own financial rules. The conspiracy theory is that is down to the threat of regulation, and they're trying to get in there ahead of the government. Whether you believe that or not is a matter of opinion. Just to go back to something David mentioned, I agree completely. We don't know the outcome, and we're kind of speculating, really. But I think one thing we can say with a degree of certainty is that despite having a date in the diary now, that is basically just the starting gun. This process will drag on for a long time. Premier League are hopeful of a verdict in the new year, but I find it inconceivable that either party won't appeal. So I'd be very surprised if there is a proper resolution until after next season. So this will drag on for 2 more seasons, I think.
I was going to say that, yeah, that kind of timeline is so difficult to predict. And as you said, David, it could be into 2025, but another 2 seasons with this hanging over Manchester City as well. Do you feel that the fan frustration will continue, just given that this delay will continue? And do you think as well it's frustrating for Manchester City supporters themselves, because people have already started to say that there's an asterisk over some of their title wins, despite the fact that these breaches are all alleged, and as David said earlier, we don't even know if Manchester City are guilty yet.
No, we don't. I think what is really intriguing is what it means for Pep Guardiola and his decision to stay or leave the club over the next 12 months. Obviously, his contract expires, and he's talked about maybe leaving, staying. No one really knows for certain. What he has said is he's on record as saying if they're guilty, then we should be relegated, and it's worthless. He said, I look them in the eyes and I believe them. We've done nothing wrong. He's been incredibly bullish in his support and defence of the club. So Pep and his reputation and his iconic status, he has as much to lose as anyone out of all this, really.
I think the ramifications of this are huge either way, whatever happens here. If Manchester City are found to be guilty, even in part, then you would imagine they face a pretty significant punishment. And that could not only affect their immediate term and their future in terms of footballing competition and chances, but also reflecting on the past and what they won during that period, titles, accolades, achievements. If they are exonerated, cleared, they're successful in their defence, then it could open up a huge can of worms on what other clubs will feel about the way they've been treated in the past, the rules and restrictions they were operating under, and what rules and restrictions they should be operating on or adhering to or not going forward. It would also massively undermine the credibility of the Premier League and the powers, the executives within the Premier League who are leading this forward. So it's a really unwanted situation either way. I think the Pep Guardiola future is a massive point. He's only under contract until the summer of 2025. We have no news on whether he will continue or not. He tends to leave his decision quite late. But if Manchester City are punished, what will he do? Will he stand by his employers and club and fight even more vigorously despite what he said in the past? Or will he turn against them and will it undermine much of his work and his reputation and that of the glorious period on the pitch that the club have enjoyed?
Well, I was going to ask you, does that affect Guardiola's legacy, do you think, at all? And were City to be found guilty, would it affect the way that people view the achievements of Guardiola? It would certainly change the way they look at the achievements of Manchester City, but what about the work that Guardiola's done?
Well, it will in some people's eyes, I'm sure. I don't think it will affect his reputation as a coach. He's clearly outstanding, improving individual players, getting the best out of them, building a team, playing great football, ultimately winning trophies. But having said that, there's already a school of thought that argues he's got the best players, anyone could do that job. If it's proven that he's got those players via the club spending above their means, breaking the rules, then yes, it could be used against him. Because ultimately, City have assembled this amazing squad of talent. If they've done it by spending more than they should have done and not declaring things and effectively lying to the authorities, then their achievements should be tarnished.
Just want to add a tiny point on that. It's not for me to defend City, but to point out the fact. There was a really heavy period of investment in the early days when this period is focused upon, so we shouldn't take our eyes away from that. One thing that is also true is that in more recent years, City have been one of the lower net spenders. You could say, well, that period built up their base, but so has it at other clubs. Paris Saint-Germain, for example, Manchester United more recently have spent eye-watering amounts of money. And it is still, no doubt about it, taken a great deal of skill, of staff, of management and of players recruited in this period where you have seen some very effective trading in and out of the club to see City one of the lower net spenders in recent years. And so I think there is an element where we do rightly need to praise their achievement. I think that's undeniable. But for that asterisk you talk about in many people's minds to be removed, then it will take, I guess, an exoneration. Otherwise, the conjecture will continue. I think it probably will either way.
We'll see how it all rumbles on. Now, if we turn our attention to something that, David, you will be very familiar with, given the summer, profit and sustainability rules, or PSR. Already I can see you giggling away because it has it's dominated this summer in terms of the transfer market. In fact, we saw that crazy day around the 30th of June, which ended up being PSR deadline day. It saw clubs such as Villa and Newcastle and Everton all involved and doing swap deals with each other. We saw a lot of homegrown talent leaving and going to other clubs, sometimes for fees that didn't seem to make too much sense. Just firstly, can you just explain to us, if you can, why this all came about and how it affected these clubs and why it was that it came to this deadline? Because surely they should have known about what was going on way before that.
Yeah, so the Premier League has always had some financial rules in place. Matt spoke earlier about their effectiveness. I don't think many clubs thought the Premier League would enforce them for a long time and they could get away with things. For right or for wrong, that was certainly a view among many clubs. And we didn't see anybody charged, really, to my memory, with financial breaches. But that appears to have changed with the Everton situation, maybe with the threat of the independent regulator from government. In recent times, we've had a system in place of aggregated losses. So you're allowed to lose a maximum of £105 million over a rolling 3-year period. Now, whatever your loss number is over that period, there are deductions that are permitted for stadium investment in youth and women's teams, and a certain number of other criteria. So Everton's loss was deemed to be over £300 million, but after the deductions, it was deemed to be £124.5 million, which was said to be £19.5 million over the permitted £105 million limit. They argued that, but were punished as we saw. Because it's a rolling cycle, their punishment, unfortunately for them, has remained within the cycle. It hasn't yet been eradicated, which led to a second charge. They've done so much work at Everton in terms of their recruitment activity under Kevin Thelwell and the leadership at the club to try and make sure that isn't going to happen in the future. Nottingham Forest came up from the Championship and they spent a huge amount of money that saw them in breach in the 3-year cycle, which confusingly overlaps the Championship, which is a different allowable loss, and the Premier League. They tried to argue that they waited on the sale of They tried to argue that they waited on the sale of Brennan Johnson to Tottenham to maximise his value. Unfortunately, they did it outside of the accounting period. It wasn't allowed within it, and so their argument was thrown out and they faced a punishment. What the other clubs have therefore seen is that the Premier League is ready to get tough, and those other clubs do not want to be in the same position. And so you could say that for quite some time now, that unofficial deadline of the 30th of June has always been there, but maybe clubs had their houses in order, or maybe it wasn't as serious a threat as it is now. I remember last year it was being talked about more and more in the industry, but it didn't really filter through into the public domain. However, this year it did. So suddenly we had the transfer deadline at the end of August, the transfer deadline at the end of January, and the PSR deadline on June the 30th. And it saw a scramble that I did feel was coming from my conversations with Premier League clubs. They knew they had holes to fill. Aston Villa were one of them. Newcastle were another one. Chelsea were convinced that they were compliant for this year, but that's another story altogether in how they became compliant with the, in the previous cycle, a sale of a couple of hotels on site. Now there's allegations or suggestions that they might have sold their women's team to parent company and so on. Manchester City and Arsenal, very little wiggle room to work with. And so, yeah, you had this remarkable situation where homegrown talent in particular, because they represent zero in the books and therefore on a sale, pure profit, were being sold by many of the clubs. Which is a debate in itself. Should football be allowing that or encouraging that? You saw all sorts of scenarios contemplated by the likes of Newcastle United. Maybe would Anthony Gordon be sold so soon after buying him to Liverpool, and players having something to think about out of the blue from nowhere all of a sudden. So it's created this sort of crazy rush to try to do business and to try to balance the books. You've seen Everton involved in that with some players between themselves and Aston Villa. A year ago, you saw Richarlison sold to Tottenham or a while ago for the same reasons. And so it's presented a new dynamic to the Premier League. I think a lot of people were, including us as journalists, breathing a sigh of relief when that June 30th deadline passed.
Was it one of the craziest weeks of your career?
It really was, because you've become so used to how the deadline works towards the end of August and the end of January. But this was a completely novel situation you found yourselves in, and you don't understand many of the rationales and reasoning as to why they're doing these sort of things. And it doesn't feel right. That's certainly something that I felt reporting on it. Not dirty, but just like, it's making use of the system to do things that you wouldn't be doing in normal circumstances, and that didn't really sit well. The confusing thing in all of this is that the PSR rules are changing, and that's something we haven't mentioned yet. So from aggregated losses, they're going to go to squad cost control rules. And that means rather than you're allowed to lose this much money over a 3-year period, you're now going to be only allowed to lose a certain percentage, 85%, of the revenue that you make. And so that, in theory, allows you to lose more than you were in the past, but limits the amount that you're allowed to spend on player salaries, player transfers, and agents' fees, mainly.
And so how's that then policed then?
Yeah, so we await full detail, but the Premier League will hope to, I guess, Matt may know more, monitor this more in live time than they've been doing before. So instead of having your 3-year assessment period and you need to have your own house in order, and then you bring it to the Premier League and they punish you or approve you retrospectively, now I think it will be more keeping the Premier League's eyes on it as we go. I think that's the intention anyway. Whether the reality seems it pans out to be the same is a different matter. And then there's a third element, I'm really sorry, within all of this, which is going to be known as anchoring, where within that system of squad cost controls, which is going to be similar to what's going on with UEFA, they've already bought it in. The percentage of what you're allowed to lose is slightly different if you're in European competitions. And by the way, the English clubs in those European competitions will need to adhere to that. So that's a different percentage to the Premier League's rule. But there will also be something called anchoring, which is each club will only be allowed to will only be allowed to spend a certain multiple of the bottom club's revenue through, is it television income?
That's what they call central funds, which is basically television and prize money.
Yeah. So if the bottom club was Southampton, who earned £100 million, and the multiple was set for, I don't know, 8 times that for the top club, and that was Manchester City, they would only be allowed to spend £800 million on their transfers and things. And so there is a lot of different accountancy mechanisms going on in the Premier League now. It confuses me and many others. It can be better explained by greater minds than me. The point that the Premier League are trying to enforce is that the Premier League remains competitive, that there's balance, that the teams at the bottom have as good a chance as anybody of beating the teams at the top, which they don't believe to be the case in other European competitions. And the ultimate aim is to make and retain the Premier League status as the best, the most watched, loved and competitive division in world football.
Matt, just on that issue of fairness, because if we're seeing PSR not phased out, but obviously they are trying, as David said there, the squad cost rule and the anchoring as well. Would you see those systems, and actually particularly the anchoring, would you see that as more fair in terms of the way the competitiveness of the Premier League will be shown? Do you think those methods will be more fair for the clubs across the league?
It's fairer in a sense that it's more relevant to this moment in time. The current PSR limits were set 10 years ago, and there's a lot of frustration that the 105 million loss figure clearly has not been updated for inflation, both in the real world and in football, which is obviously run far ahead of the real world, as it always does. So the clubs will be given more leeway in the future. So that will be well received. I think it's important that it aligns largely with UEFA's regulations as well, because given the expansion of European competitions, we're now seeing 6, 7, 8 English clubs in Europe every year. So that's an improved position. In terms of the anchoring, the devil will be in the detail, as often the case. Obviously, the bigger clubs will push for a larger multiple. David mentioned 8. I think at the moment it will be between 5 and 6 times, which still gives Man City, Arsenal, ability to spend a huge amount more money than
because if you look at, I think Man City's squad cost is something around 470 or close to 500. So surely, if it's only 5 times, let's say it was Southampton, like David said, and let's say it was 105 million or whatever it is, that surely would still give City the wiggle room, if you want, to work with this. So how are they going to decide what the multiple becomes?
They're going to get in a room and argue about it and try and get 14 chairs and chief execs to agree. That's how it works in the Premier League. It's a members' club. The Premier League doesn't really exist. There's an executive that enforce things and obviously a huge legal team, but basically the clubs themselves decide the rules, which is ironic given they've spent much of the last 3 years arguing about them and complaining about them after the fact.
Does it give you the feeling, like it does many of the public, even with these new rules, that it benefits the rich? The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That if you're allowed to spend a certain percentage of your revenue, well, Manchester United have the biggest revenue and they'll be able to way outspend somebody like an Aston Villa, who have really ambitious owners who want to spend, on Newcastle United, on paper the richest club in world football, but because their revenues are relatively small compared to Manchester United, they just can't spend that sort of money.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the rules as set up and as they will evolve favour the bigger, more established clubs. It's no coincidence that it's the medium-sized clubs and the sort of newly promoted ones that have had all the PSR problems. Everton, Forest, Leicester this season. Having said that, the impact is felt by the bigger clubs. Manchester United's spending has been restrained by PSR. They've just managed to manage the situation a bit better. They haven't breached. Arsenal and Tottenham, their spending has also been restricted because of fear of breaching. I mean, the really interesting one is Chelsea, really, because they haven't had any breaches yet, haven't been charged, but they've had to come up with some very creative ways to avoid that, which will create potentially more problems down the line. So the implications are felt by everyone, just in different ways.
Just on Manchester United, Stefan Borson, the football finance expert, was speaking on talkSPORT the other day about potential special allowances that Manchester United got that helped them get past PSR. And one of those was a COVID payment, he was saying, of 40 million, when compared to other clubs who are only receiving about 1 million around this stage. I mean, it was quite a shocking thing to hear, I'm sure, for fans of many other clubs. Why do you think it was that Manchester United were allowed these special allowances?
Well, all Premier League clubs, in fact all football clubs, were given allowances for COVID. The reason that figure, £40 million at United, has emerged is because they're a listed company, so it's in their accounts. We don't know what allowances other clubs were given. Everton, for example, were given huge allowances. They must have been to avoid being charged 2-3 years ago, because their losses for the 21-22 season were about £350 million and only 105's permitted. So quite clearly they were given what they call add-backs for COVID. Eventually, in the subsequent years, they were charged. But unless we've got full transparency on every club's accounts, we don't really know. So I think it's sort of slightly mischievous to single out Manchester United in that way.
David, just going back to what you said as well about the likes of Aston Villa and Newcastle, who have these ambitious owners and want to spend. When you look at this situation and how limited, I think particularly Newcastle have been by the PSR rules that have been in place, can you understand the frustration of fans who want to see that ambition from their club shown, that they have been limited in this way, whilst, for instance, the likes of Chelsea have been able to spend more money because of the revenues that they have? Or do you think that actually at some point the line has to be drawn, and unfortunately for Newcastle this has been the time that has been drawn?
We're all fans, and so we understand the frustration, whether it's our club or not. And if we were in that position, we'd feel the same as the fans that are annoyed. And, you know, when you look at the Newcastle situation, I think their supporters would have felt that it was the most, many of their supporters would have felt it was the most amazing thing in their modern history, that they had received a takeover from the on-paper richest ownership in world football. And yeah, you reference Aston Villa having very ambitious and wealthy owners, and there are a number of other clubs as well. And then that frustration is probably amplified when you see clubs with the greater resources who almost can get away with wasting money and bad recruitment because their revenues are through the roof. Commercially, all over the world, in terms of their fan bases and what they can generate. And it's almost like there's no margin for error lower down the table. I'm afraid that a couple of things. There's a bit of a food chain in all walks of life, and so those clubs have manoeuvred themselves into those positions by virtue of their fan bases, by virtue of their good commercial operations, by virtue of their footballing success. And so, you know, you can't just look up enviously at that sort of thing. And for whatever reason, whether your history is less spectacular in terms of trophies, in terms of commercial operation, in terms of fan base, some of that you have to suck up. There do also have to be some rules in place, because we've seen some dire situations in English football and all over the world. But off the top of my head, like a Portsmouth, a Bolton Wanderers, a Bury, where the authorities, the government, communities cannot afford repeats of that, and clubs going into financial turmoil and ruin, administration and liquidation, and they want to make sure that doesn't happen again. Now, fans of a Newcastle and Aston Villa will turn around and say, well, that's not happened. That's not going to happen at our place. And you know, that there's even been suggestions, what about almost like a rainy day fund, which I quite like the thought of, but I don't know how it would work in practicality, that every owner that wants to spend whatever they want to spend should put away some money to the Premier League or central fund or under lock and key. That in the event of the owner walking off or being sanctioned in another country or pulling the plug or not being there, that this fund could be used to keep the club sustainable for a period of time, pay wages, salaries, until they find new ownership. That's quite interesting. But there do have to be rules. Otherwise, it would be the Wild West. It would risk causing dire situations. It's just about trying to find the right place within those rules. And unfortunately, within the Premier League, as Matt has outlined, it's 20 clubs sat in a room or on conference calls. There's agenda, there's perspectives, there's ego, there's a lot of wealth, there's influence, there are back-channel communications, and a lot of the time it's leading to clubs butting heads. There's politics involved. It's naive of us to think that, the Manchester City case, I think this has actually been documented, has at least been discussed at, governmental level between Abu Dhabi and Great Britain. I think there are public minutes available that sort of show that. What was said, we don't know. And this is all at play. I feel it's actually quite sad. This is a bit of a tangent, but most of our time now is spent, and thankfully the rise of shows like this and certain podcasts about football finance and the politics and business and the governance of it all. But we're talking more about battles in legal chambers, in courtrooms, in hotel conference suites at Premier League AGMs and meetings than we are about the action on the pitch. And yes, when the whistle blows, we do have a focus and that thrill and excitement, but not the way it was before. My reporting now seems, as you said, more about PSR than the actual sport. And I think that's sad. It's not acceptable for many fans. It's not great for the product at a time where there's fierce competition from other sports for our eyeballs and attention, for sponsorship deals, etc. So football needs to be careful not to get away from the essence of what it is.
And Matt, there's a big shame of all of this as well, being something that David alluded to, the fact that homegrown players for a lot of these deals have been used almost as bargaining chips. I mean, we've seen, the likes of Elliot Anderson, for instance, with Newcastle go off to Nottingham Forest. Do you think it's a shame for football fans of clubs like this that they're not going to be able to watch those young talents, those local lads as well, come up through the ranks just because they were the prime assets to be able to get round these kind of rules?
I think that is a shame for the fans, but it's also an issue for the players themselves. I think there are big duty of care issues as an unintended consequence of this June 30 deadline. I remember in June I was talking to Maheta Malongo, the PFA chief executive, and he was really pretty animated and angry with the way some clubs are behaving. I wrote a story about Newcastle's desire to get rid of Yankuba Minte to raise funds to avoid them having to sell someone like Anthony Gordon, which just illustrates how chaotic those few days were at St James's Park. They did a deal with Leon, he didn't want to go, he was basically refusing to go, which is his right because he has a contract. Why should he have to go and leave to go and work in another country? Eventually they managed to do a deal with Brighton and the issue was resolved and Newcastle are now compliant. But it does raise ethical issues as well if, these young footballers, athletes, should be basically sort of traded as commodities rather than seen as human beings. So, as is often the case, there are unintended consequences for the rules that the Premier League have brought in. David, do you go along with that, the sense that actually, as much as, let's be honest, they're very well paid players, it's a dream job for many people, but actually the way that they are being treated almost as pawns in these situations does need looking at and isn't quite acceptable for the way that clubs are using them?
Yeah, I don't know how it would exactly work because this is making use of an accounting method and that had been established over a period of time. It's not that football decided to make academy products 0 in the books. It's because the value of footballers, like a commodity, is based on a system that involves transfer fees. That's a global system. And so as a player signs for a club and their value is amortized over the length of the contract, that is how the numbers work. That wasn't a conscious decision. Whereas the player that is graduating through the academy was not transferred into the club. No transfer fee was placed upon them, and therefore you can't put a value on them other than 0. And therefore some kind of special measure would need to be brought in by the Premier League, and again, mine's far brighter than mine, to protect the homegrown player, if that was a decision that they did indeed want to take, like many of us feel they perhaps should, or maybe that less weight should be placed on the player who has been signed, in terms of you adjust the value during the. I think it's very complicated, but it has become quite unseemly, and questions are sort of raised. And I don't want to sort of shirk this onto other people, but it is other people rather than me. When I'm reporting, say, an Amari Kellerman is moving from Aston Villa to Chelsea for, was it about £19 million with a couple of senior appearances, and value when you look on a transfer market type website is, say, at 2 million, and there's no sort of rival bids at that moment, and if they were and at market value it would be far lower. Of course it raises eyebrows. There are boys who have been involved in these situations who were very happy at their clubs and had no idea of moving, were developing very nicely, came through at that particular club, and then all of a sudden the clubs reach an agreement and they're told you've got to move, or at least we need to discuss you moving, and they may not want to, they may not intend to, it may not be the best thing for them geographically, for their health, for their mental well-being, for their sporting career. They might not be forced to move, but things can become uncomfortable. Are you not going to be in the first team building? Are you not going to get minutes? The salary offer from the other club is really lucrative. There are various other perks. You are going to be integrated into the first team. And all of a sudden, within hours or days or maybe weeks of a transfer window, this has happened. And it does increasingly and more than ever feel like footballers are being treated, I don't want to be too harsh, but like a piece of meat or a number or a piece on a chessboard being moved around. And that was the essence I got from a lot of the conversations I had in the build-up to June 30. And even now, in fairness, post that, if we can move this one here, we can bring this one in here, and if that happens, then this can happen. I guess that was always the conversation, but I think the human side has been sucked out of it a little bit. And I will defend the clubs to an extent, because they are operating within a system that exists on the watch of the Premier League and the other European leagues, and UEFA and FIFA in the global transfer system. And the clubs could turn around and say, what do you expect us to do? And the other thing I would say on all of this, and a point you mentioned to me earlier about the fans and frustration and dissatisfaction, we can't have everything. We bay for signings and transfers. You should see on my social media when you could post on socials about a transfer or potential transfer during a football match, during even one of the biggest football matches, and you would get much more interaction on your post around the transfer than you would about the match. It's a sport separate to the sport itself. The appetite is insatiable. People are salivating over the deals. They want to know every twist and turn and where this player is then, and they're formulating, encouraged by games like Football Manager, who they want to go here. We'll sign him and he can go there. And
tracking
then we're
flights,
all done.
everything.
Tracking flights, you name it. And then So the clubs are trying to develop their footballing teams and their clubs. They're also trying to satisfy the desires of their fans for new players, for excitement, to improve, to succeed, despite the fact that when a signing comes in, the second it's done, the fans are on to the next one. It's like the one they've been speaking about for all these months is yesterday's news. And so within all of that, we can't have sort of too many complaints about clubs trying things, because part of the reason they're trying it is for this entertainment industry. But there is something that is not so pleasant about it all. That has probably always been the case in various ways, shape or forms.
Just to come in there, David, one point I'd like to make. Well, you're right, the Premier League clubs are having to live within their means, work with the system that they've been given. I do think there is an element of young players and homegrown players being used to make amends for their club's previous mistakes.
Definitely.
If you look at Chelsea, for example, the reason Conor Gallagher is in Madrid, is he still in Madrid?
Well, he's on his way back as we record this.
Tracker, David,
but the reason Conor Gallagher is going, the reason Trevor Chalobah is going, is because Chelsea desperately need to raise revenue because they've wasted money in the last 2 years on players that haven't worked. And it's the same to an extent at other clubs as well. If clubs were better run, didn't waste so much money on fees and agents' commissions, they wouldn't have to sell these players. And I also think it's worth pointing out it's not every club. There are some clubs in the Premier League that are very, very well run and are actually making money in the transfer market still. But Brighton and Brentford, there are no PSR issues and they're overperforming their budget every year in the top 10, 12 in the Premier League. So it can be done. And sometimes it's a bit easy to make excuses for these clubs and to blame the rules. If they were better run in the first place, they wouldn't be having to sell the crown jewels.
It just seems like such a shame, doesn't it? Because it's one of the best things about being a football fan is watching a local player or a young player that's come through the system play for your club as well. Now it's time for our talkSPORT Explainer. This is the part of the show where our panellists try and make sense of the question on everybody's lips, and right now that is, just how are Chelsea signing so many players? The club spent over £185 million since June. They've got almost 50 senior players on the books and are still looking for more. How and why? David, I'll come to you on this one first. Is there a sense that Chelsea... It just seems bizarre, doesn't it? They have managed to build a squad. I reckon most Chelsea fans would not be able to name the amount of players that are in that roster at the moment. If we put it in basic terms, how have they done this?
For once, I'll try and keep my answer relatively short and concise. They've spent a huge amount of money, Chelsea, on transfer fees. They would argue that they've not spent a huge amount of money in relative terms on salaries, that they've tried to dramatically bring the wage bill down from the previous regime. That's their argument, and that they're going to run a far tighter wage structure going forward. And they've sold a hell of a lot of players as well. And when we look at the PSR situation, the sale comes in and is banked, or at least put in the financial accounts in full in the immediate term. And the purchase is spread out over the length of the contract. So these 7-8 year contracts, the UEFA have put a limit at 5, the Premier League are bringing it down to 5, which means you can only account it over 5 years. You can still give them the 8, 9, 10 year, whatever year contract you like. And so the spread, say Chelsea signed Mudryk for £100 million, over a 10-year contract, then for the first year that would just be £10 million in the books. They sell Mason Mount for £65 million, and they put that £65 million in the book straight away. And so in that particular transaction that I've explained, it's 10 as the cost and 65 as the income, and therefore 55 as the profit. And that's going on across the board. As the players leave on higher salaries that Chelsea say from the previous regime, players are coming in on lower salaries. So when they're looking at somebody like João Felix now, Atletico Madrid, if they can get the right transfer fee to their liking. The talk is, will he reduce his salary to fit into Chelsea's structure? And really, in football now, it's largely about the salaries, because that is the real cost on football clubs, as opposed to the transfer fees, because of that spread. And Chelsea will argue, the new regime certainly, that they've had to do a lot of cleaning of house or rebuilding from what they inherited. So they lost players like Antonio Rudiger and Andreas Christensen as free agents, players with significant value, because their contracts expired. They don't want that to happen again. That's why they sold Mason Mount for £65 million or whatever it was to Manchester United, and they're desperately trying to sell Conor Gallagher now because he's only got 12 months to go and there's no sign of a new contract. So whether people like what I'm saying or what Chelsea have explained or not, there are two things. They are balancing the books to whatever extent with outgoings to counteract the incomings. There is a lot of trading going on there that makes it plausible. And it's not that it's plausible to me, it's plausible to the Premier League and UEFA, because right now Chelsea haven't breached the PSR rules. And until that happens, they are obviously complying. And sorry if people shout at me for that, but I'm just saying what I see and hear from the questions that I ask.
Well, Matt, given that back in December, the Premier League clubs, I think, voted to try and close that Chelsea loophole that David was talking about there in terms of giving these extremely long contracts, they want to bring them down to just 5 years. Has this been smart business by Chelsea? Because the two players that we mentioned there were Mudryk and Fernandes, and in the short term, there's been all sorts going on at Chelsea, but you know, I think any Chelsea fan would say that those signings at the moment haven't quite worked. They've got these incredibly lengthy contracts. But do you think that this is a case that we'll be sitting here in 5-6 years' time saying, wow, Chelsea had it all worked out and it's worked out brilliantly for them? Or do you actually think that maybe the way they've approached this doesn't quite apply to football as a sport?
Well, what I would say is they've navigated the rules as they exist at the moment quite well. And they have achieved what David set out. They've managed to reduce their wage bill and sign lots of exciting young players. However, they've not performed as a team on the pitch, which is why they're out of the Champions League. They're reluctantly having to enter the Europa Conference League, which they don't want to, but they will be there. More games, more fatigue for the players, very little revenue and not much prestige, frankly. So short term, they're fine. Longer term, big potential problems. As David explained, they've managed to comply with the rules by selling players very effectively, and particularly homegrown players, as we've discussed with Gallagher. The other way they've done it is by some very creative accounting. They've sold 2 hotels that they owned to their parent company, and they also appear to have sold their women's team to their parent company. What is important to point out is that both those transactions have yet to be signed off by the Premier League. Until they are, that is an issue for Chelsea. The second sale of the women's team is particularly interesting because Chelsea valued Chelsea ladies at about £150 million. They only generate £9 million a year, so that seems to me at least quite a high valuation. Whether the Premier League's legal and finance team agree with Chelsea, we don't know, but it's certainly one to watch. And the final issue is that everything for Chelsea this season, I think, is reliant upon them qualifying for the Champions League. They've been outside it for a second season now. If they can't get back in, that will be a huge hit to their revenue, affects their ability to attract sponsors. They currently haven't got a shirt sponsor. It feels like they're just about surviving every year, but they may run out of road quite soon unless they start to perform better and get results, and that's down to the manager.
A really important add in this is that for these rule changes that you talk about, closing of loopholes, in the Premier League, it needs to be voted through by the Premier League clubs. So you need as things stand, the rules are a 2/3 majority, 14 of the 20 Premier League clubs at least. And talked about a lot of politics at play. It may be that clubs vote tactically because they want a bit of wiggle room in these rules. They might find themselves in a similar position to the other club who are against them at some point in the future, or they want to do business with them at some point, and so they abstain or they vote in the same direction. And maybe some of these rule changes don't get passed. Or, I don't know, there's even, for the nerds out there, there's even conjecture over, when we talk about fair value in the sponsorship deals and in these transfer transactions, some of the clubs don't feel that the Premier League has the right company firm assessing fair market value, and they want a bigger auditing company assessing fair value. Now, whether that's for face value reasons or to delay the process further so they continue operating, there's a lot going on here below the surface and much more than meets the eye that leads these waters to be muddied. And back to a point Matt made earlier, that's a large reason why there's this independent regulator threatened, proposed, meant to be coming in from the previous government. Of course, that now changes somewhat or gets delayed or derailed or with the new government, Labour, coming into power. But the essence of that is to try and clean up some of this mess and to say to football and the Premier League, if you don't get your act together, we're going to do it for you. And that extends, very importantly, to things like redistribution of wealth to the English Football League and the grassroots, all of which we don't have resolution on so far, and is going to keep this show in business for many weeks.
Yeah, very much so. There is so much more still to discuss, but we will leave it for another day. Matt and David, thank you very much indeed for your time. Well, that brings an end to today's episode. If you want to get involved, post your comments below and our expert panel will answer them as best they can. Thank you very much for your company, and our thanks to David Ornstein and Matt Hughes.